And just to refresh your memory and to tell to the people who were not here yesterday what we've done. We've looked at institutions, what are they, what is their effect, why do we have institutions, and we looked at institutionalization. And today I want to look at what are the effects of institutions, and also at why are institutions persistent, why are they path dependent, and why do they sometimes change. And actually I'd like to start, and I hope it works because we have had some technical problems, with a little clip, YouTube clip, in which we show, or no, we show, David Harvey shows what institutions actually can mean for the economy and for society at large. David Harvey is a geographer and a sociologist, actually a Marxist geographer and a sociologist from the University of Oxford, and he is a brilliant researcher, although there are some criticisms you can have against his approach. He can explain very clearly the meaning of institutions and how the economy is run through institutions. So let's try if it works. Please look at it from a critical perspective. I think it's a 10-minute clip. I'm used to having problems with that. And it's his voice, and there is a cartoonist who draws the system as he explains it.
Thanks a lot. We have time.
Yeah, his development. And think about it. Do you think this is a convincing story that he tells, or do you think differently about it? So don't consume it without any critique.
Okay, so we've been through this crisis, and there are all sorts of explanatory formats out there, and it's interesting to look at the different genres. One genre is that it's all about human frailty. I mean, Alan Greenspan took refuge in the fact that it's human nature. He said you can't do anything about that. But there's a whole world of explanations that kind of say it's the predatory instinct, it's the instincts for mastery, it's the delusions of investors and greed and all the rest of it. So there's a whole range of discussion of that. And of course, the more we learn about the daily practices on Wall Street, we kind of figure there's a great deal of truth in all of that. The second genre is that there's institutional failures. Regulators who are asleep at the switch, the shadow banking system innovated outside of their purview, etc., 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 and therefore institutions have to be reconfigured, and it has to be a global effort by the G20 or something of that kind. So we look at the institutional level and say that has failed and that has to be reconfigured. The third genre is to say everybody was obsessed with a false theory. They read too much Hayek and believed in the efficiency of markets, and it's time we actually got back to something like Keynes, or we took seriously Hyman Minsky's theory about the inherent instability of financial activities. And the next genre is that it has cultural origins. Now, we don't hear that much in the United States, but if you were in Germany and France, there are many people there who kind of say this is an Anglo-Saxon disease, and it's nothing to do with us. I happened to be in Brazil when it was going on, and Lula was kind of saying, well, first off he was saying, oh, thank God the United States is being disciplined by the equivalent of the IMF. We've been through it 8 times in the last 25 years, and now it's their turn. Fantastic, said Lula. And all the Latin Americans I knew, and sort of hit them, which it does, and then they kind of changed their tune a little bit. So there was a kind of a way in which it became cultural, and you can see that, by the way, in which this whole Greek thing is being handled, where the German press is saying, well, it's the Greek character, it's defects in the Greek character, and there's a lot of rather nasty stuff going on around that, but actually there are some cultural features which have led into it. For instance, the US fascination with home ownership, which is supposedly a deep cultural value, so 67, 68% of US households are home owners, only 22% in Switzerland. Of course, it's a cultural value in the United States that's been supported by the mortgage interest tax deduction, which is a huge subsidy. It's been promoted since the 1930s, very explicitly in the 1930s. It was built up because the theory was that debt-incumbent homeowners don't go on strike. And then there's a kind of notion that there's a failure of policy, and that policy has actually intervened. And there's a funny kind of alliance emerging between the Glenn Beck wing for Fox News and the World Bank, both of whom say the problem is too much regulation of the wrong sort. So there are all of these ways, and all of them have a certain truth. And skilled writers will take one or other of those perspectives and build a story and actually write a very plausible kind of story about this. And I thought to myself, well, what kind of plausible story can I write which is none of the above? Which is one of the things I always think to myself. And it's not hard to do, particularly if it comes from a Marxist perspective, because, you know, there aren't many people who try to do this analysis from a Marxist perspective. And I was really clued into this by this thing that happened at the London School of Economics about a year and a half ago when Her Majesty the Queen asked the economists, how come you guys didn't see this thing coming? I shouldn't say it exactly that way, but, you know, it's a sort of sentiment. And they got very upset, and then she actually called the Government Bank of England and said, how come you didn't see it coming? And then the British Academy put forward this, got all these economists, and they came up with this fabulous letter to Her Majesty. And it was actually astonishing. It said, well, you know, many dedicated people, intelligent, smart, spent their lives working on aspects of this thing very, very seriously, but the one thing we missed was systemic risk. And you say, what? And they went on to talk about politics of denial and all the rest of it. So I thought, well, you know, systemic risk, you know, I can translate it into the Marxian thing. You're talking about the internal contradictions of capital accumulation. And maybe I should write a thing about the internal contradictions of capital accumulation and try to figure out the role of crises in the whole history of capitalism and what's specific and special about the crisis this time. And there were two ways in which I thought I would do that. One was to sort of look at what's happened since the 1970s to now. And the thesis there is that in many ways the form of this current crisis is dictated very much by the way we came out of the last one. That the problem back in the 1970s was excessive power of labour in relationship to capital. But therefore the way out of the crisis last time was disciplined labour. And we know how that was done. It was done by offshoring, it was done by, you know, Thatcher and Reagan, and it was done by neoliberal doctrine, it was done all kinds of different ways. But by 1985 or 86, the labour question had essentially been solved for capital. It had access to all the world's labour supplies. Nobody in this particular instance has cited greedy unions as the root of the crisis. Nobody in this instance is saying it has anything to do with excessive power of labour. If anything, it's the excessive power of capital, and in particular the excessive power of finance capital, which is the root of the problem. Now, how did that happen? Well, we've been since the 1970s in a phase of what we call wage repression. That wages have been remaining stagnant. The share of wages in national income right throughout the OECD countries has steadily fallen. It's even steadily fallen in China, of all places. So that there are less and less being paid out in wages. Well, wages turn out to be also the money which buys goods. So if you diminish wages, then you've got a problem with where's your demand going to come from? And the answer was, well, get out your credit cards. We'll give everybody credit cards. So we'll overcome, if you like, the problem of effective demand by actually pumping up the credit economy. And American households, British households, have all roughly tripled their debt over the last 20, 30 years. And a vast amount of that debt, of course, has been within the housing market. And out of this comes a theory which is very, very important, that capitalism never solves its crisis problems. It moves them around geographically. And what we're seeing right now is a geographical movement of that. Everybody says, well, okay, everything's beginning to recover in the United States, and then Greece goes bang, and then everybody goes, what about the pigs, you know? And it's interesting, you had a finance crisis, which is kind of in the financial system. You sort of half solved that, but at the expense of the sovereign debt crisis. Actually, if you look at the accumulation process of capital, you see a number of limits and a number of barriers. And there's a wonderful language that Marx uses in the Greenwich, where he talks about the way in which capital cannot buy a limit. It has to turn it into a barrier which then circumvents or transcends. And then when you look at the accumulation process, you look at where the barriers and limits might lie. And the simple way to look at it is to say, look, the typical circulation process of accumulation goes like this. You start with some money, you go into the market and you buy labour, power and means of production. Then you put that means then to work with a given technology and organisational form. You create a commodity, which you then sell for the original money plus a profit. Now, you then take part of the profit and you recapitalise it into expansion for very interesting reasons. There are two things about this. One is there are a number of barrier points in here. How is the money got together in the right place at the right time, in the right volume? And that takes financial ingenuity. So the whole history of capitalism has been about financial innovation. And financial innovation has the effect of also empowering the financiers. And the excessive power of the financiers can sometimes, they do get greedy, no question about it. And if you look at financial profits in the United States, they were soaring up in 1990. They're going up like this. Profits in manufacturing are coming down like this. And you could see the imbalance in this country. I think the way in which this country has sided with the City of London against British manufacturing since the 1950s onwards has had very serious implications for the economy of this country. You've actually screwed industry in order to keep, financiers happy. Any sensible person right now would join an anti-capitalist organisation. And you have to. Because otherwise we're going to have the continuation. And notice it's a continuation of all sorts of negative aspects. For instance, the racking up of wealth. You would have thought the crisis would have stopped that. Actually, more billionaires emerged in India last year than ever. They doubled last year. The wealth of the rich, I just read something this morning, in this country has accelerated. Just last year. What happened was that leading hedge fund owners got personal remunerations of $3 billion each in 1 year. Now, I thought it was obscene and insane a few years ago when they got 250 million. But they're now hauling in 3 billion. Now, that's not a world I want to live in, and if you want to live in it, be my guest. I don't see us debating and discussing this. I don't have the solution. I think I know what the nature of the problem is. And unless we're prepared to have a very broad-based discussion that gets away from, the normal kind of problem you get in a political campaign and, everything's going to be okay here next year if you vote for me, it's crap. You should know it's crap and say it is. And we have a duty, it seems to me, those of us who are academics and seriously involved in the work, to actually change our mode of thinking.
Well, just to show you that institutions are everywhere and really rule or have a big influence on how the economy and society is run. Did you think it was a convincing story, or did you have any critique on it? Like I said yesterday, this is really a deterministic view on institutions that a lot of Marxist theorists have. So like institutions sort of dictate our actions without us having any ability to break out of these institutional barriers, So it is a particular view on institutions, not necessarily my view on institutions, but, well, I think it's just a nice illustration to show you that institutions have a big effect on society and on the economy. Well, back to urban development. Yesterday I said to you, institutions have an effect on actors, and that has an effect on behavior, and that has an effect on the planning process and on the planning object. And I would like to explore these two with you today, starting with the planning process. And I actually want to start with an example from the Netherlands. The Netherlands has a new planning act since 2008 in which it tries to solve a couple of issues. It is a major revision of the old act, and it has a couple of goals. It wants a quicker planning process, a more plan-led form of planning, and a division of responsibilities of different tiers of government. You can forget about that. What I did, I was employed by this Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency to make an evaluation of the Act, and that's what we did over the last couple of years. And, well, probably good for you to explain how planning in the Netherlands works. If you want to build a house, you're going to check, does it fit within the land use plan? Does it fit within the land use plan? Yes or no? If it does fit, you get permission. There's no doubt about that. You can't reject permission. But under the old Act, if it didn't fit, you could say as a government, I'm going to reject it. Reject. I'm going to revise the plan. Or I'm going to use an exemption. And what happened in practice is that a lot of local authorities said, okay, we want this house to be built, and we are going ahead. We're not going to reject it, we're not going to revise the land use plan, we're going to use an exemption. That's the easiest way to grant a planning permission. And that's what you see, that's the remote. And that's what you see when you look at this graph. Only look at the green bars. Bestemmingsplan means land use plan. And what you see is that it was primarily exemptions that were used and not so many bestemmingsplan, land use plans. That's the dark green part of the bar. So municipalities took the easiest way out. As a result of that, land use plans were never revised. And what you then get is that land use plans get really obsolete. Obsolete means that they are older than 10 years old, and 63% of the land use plans were older than that. And if local authorities made land use plans, they rather recorded developments than planned developments. So it was usually using them after an initiative had been taken, and actually the plan recorded that development. The reason was that, for that, is that local authorities use these land use plans primarily as a strategic tool to sort of guide developments. They wanted to have control, and it's very easy to have an obsolete land use plan, because if somebody comes with an initiative, chances are great that the initiative does not fit within the land use plan. So then you can say, okay, I would like to revise it for you, or I would give like to give an exemption. But then you have to conform to these and these conditions. So obsolete plans turned out to be a strong tool. Well, the new Act actually said we don't want that anymore. We don't want any exemptions anymore, and we want the land use plan to become plan-led again. So we want new initiatives to be based on the plan. And therefore the land use plan had to become the key document again. And the government wanted the plan to be a steering plan, one that plans ahead and not records things afterwards. So the exemption was actually deleted, this one, and instead of that the government wanted to have a project decision. Well, but because it wanted a plan-led system, it made this project decision very, very unattractive. And here are a couple of measures that have been taken. For instance, if you took a project decision, the land use plan had to be put on public display within 1 year after the project decision. So you had to do the whole procedure twice. And actually, both procedures were equal in time. Under the old Act, the land use plan had to be approved by the province, but that approval had been taken away under the new Act, so the procedure became equal. And the project decisions has two options of appeal. So there's a greater danger that the court rejects a project decision. So a very unattractive instrument. So the result is what you see in this graph, the blue, if you look at the blue bars. Now all of a sudden the land use plan has become much more attractive. and the project decision has been taken only only a limited number of times. So really, you would say this is a very plan-led system nowadays. However, if you're going to look at the plans, you see something different. If you look at this one, you see 53% of the plans is only used, like this one, these very small plans to approve a concrete development. 35% is used to actually confirm current land uses. So what you see is a very detailed topographic map. And in the last picture you see what we call a plan-led plan. That is a plan where there is not yet any initiative and the government is actually looking for new initiatives. So they don't know yet what is going to come. And that's why we call it the plan-led plan. And as you see, only 8% of these plans is actually planning ahead, envisaging new initiatives that are not yet there. So what can we learn from it? Well, some of the findings. The land use plans have actually substituted these exemptions. So it's still not very plan-led. It's still a very project-led systems, and that has to do with the strong incentives. But still, as I said, it doesn't have a steering function yet. What was I going to say? Yeah, like I said, the plan-led plan, although central government wanted that plan-led system, really conflicts with local practice. Local governments want a development-led practice and therefore use the plan in a slightly different way. And there are actually in the whole system no real incentives for promoting a plan-led system, and there are more disincentives actually for that. And that has to do with the fact that the plan needs some kind of certainty. You already need to know what is going to happen, and that has to do with environmental regulations, with the court decisions. So legal certainty is a big thing. So you can't have an open-ended plan without very concrete ideas of what's going to happen already. And local governments in the Netherlands have a very strong wish to control, and this development-led practice actually gives them much greater tools to control development than a plan-led system. So really, back to institutions, what does it mean? Like I said, formal institutions affect the development process or the planning process. Sorry. Like I said, there was provincial approval under the old Act, and that meant that the development process or the planning process was twice as long under the old Act as it was under the new Act. So what you could see is that actually the law was able to speed the planning process up. And it shows you that formal institutions can have a major influence on the planning process. However, and I think this is really important, central government wanted to have a plan-led system that sort of had institutionalized at the central level, but that didn't institutionalize at the local level. That level was still very much development-led. So rules are not institutions at every level. So the plan-led system had been institutionalized at the central level, but has never institutionalized at the local level. And a second lesson, or a third lesson actually to be learned, is that new rules that take insufficient account of existing institutions and are not in tune with these institutions are actually doomed to performing effectively and efficiently. And I think I've tried to show that in this scheme, which is an extension of the scheme I showed you yesterday. So you see the interaction between formal and informal institutions, and the effect that has on actors, on behavior, and then again on the planning process and the planning object. I was actually trying to use this as an example of how institutions can influence the planning process. Then we go to the planning object, and yet again, like I said yesterday, the planning object is what you could call cities, neighborhoods, industrial estates, city centers, all that sort of thing. And I would like to explain the working of institutions by referring to two examples. And this is actually what I call the underwater screen of the city. I don't know if you know the word underwater screen. Has any of you ever worked with WordPerfect, or are you too young for that? Probably. WordPerfect was the sort of predecessor of Word, and there was an option which was called the underwater screen, and you could see the coding behind the whole document. And actually institutions is what I would call the coding behind what you see, well, what we see around us. So we're talking here about what I call the underwater screen of the city. And I want to explain that by referring to Houston, Texas, and by referring to industrial estates in the Netherlands. Has anyone of you ever been to the US? Maybe fingers? No one? You? Anyone? Yeah, you of course. So no one has probably ever gone to Houston, Texas. It's the fourth biggest city in the United States. It runs on oil. And here are some images that I would like to show. What you see here is the downtown area, and to the left-hand side is what is the ring road around the downtown area. And you see a couple of skyscrapers, but what you see primarily are parking spaces. These are all parking spaces. And I think this is a very clear image of that. So it's a really, it's a dreadful downtown area, this Houston area. And it's actually what you could call a donut city. Ever heard of that? So there's nothing here in the middle, in the center, and these are the suburbs. So the heart is really empty, and this is what you see here. Well, actually in Houston it's a bit different. You've got something here, and then there is nothing, and then you get the suburbs. I was living there, actually outside of Houston, and it took me an hour and a half to get there, but after 50 minutes already, you got the first suburbs. So it's really spread out, you know. So there is a great degree of urban sprawl with a lot of negative side effects. Houston has the most obese population in the United States, and if you get there you will easily see that. It has an extremely high energy use. And another feature that's very interesting is that it doesn't have any zoning. It doesn't have a zoning plan. Zoning is actually the same as having a land use plan, and with that it's actually probably the biggest city on earth without any zoning plan, especially actually in the Western world. And therefore people say, well, sprawl is actually the result of the free market. You know, there is no zoning, so the sprawl is the result of doing nothing. But what I actually try to show here is that sprawl is a social construction. It's the result of all sorts of institutions. It didn't happen automatically or naturally. It's not a natural event that occurred, but it's the result of human action. And I'd like to show you a couple of examples of this. For instance, there are so-called minimum lot size regulations in Houston. A detached house has to stand on 5,000 square feet, which is very big. You know, that's a minimum size, not a maximum size. So what you then get is really big plots. Terrace housing has a similar regulation, although it's half the square footage. And if you compare it to other big cities, you see that it's extremely big, these minimum lot sizes that Houston, Texas has. Terraced housing is actually, do you know what terraced housing is? So it's houses in one row, you know, they are connected in a row. So it actually has an anti-terraced housing policy or a townhouse policy. Also, if you look at parking spaces, it has a very strict regulations on parking spaces, and it makes a lot of room for parking, as you can see. The studio has 1.25 parking spaces, which is obviously a lot, because usually in a studio there's only one person living and it has more than one car attached to it, which is a way to increase urban sprawl. And here you can see many examples of minimum park size regulations. Street width is another thing that you can see really reproduces or creates urban sprawl. Major arteries, major roads in Houston have to be at least 30 meters wide. And Houston has two very big ring roads, and that obviously takes up a lot of space. And pavements, that's very interesting. When I was there, I didn't have a car in the beginning, and I thought, okay, let's have a walk, but there are no pavements whatsoever in the whole city. So, yeah, that's something that doesn't take up a lot of space. Another way in which urban sprawl is being promoted is by creating a lot of water and sewage capacity way before development is taking place. So it is actually anticipating future growth by creating enough capacity for what they call utilities. And like I said, finally, there is the development of infrastructure, which they do a lot. So what I basically want to say here is that urban sprawl is very much planned. It's not a natural event, it's the result of institutions. And I think it's a good example of showing the importance of institutions for urban development. But the other example I would like to show is the example of industrial estates in the Netherlands. This is a typical industrial estate in the Netherlands. And a lot of people in the Netherlands say we have too many of them. Well, I don't know exactly, but how are they produced in the Netherlands? In the Netherlands, local authorities think they are in competition with each other. They all want to attract employment, they all want to attract businesses, and they think if we don't do that, if we don't provide land for industrial estates, they will go to neighboring municipalities. So let's provide land for industrial estates. And the result is that 75% of land for industrial estates is being provided by local authorities. And the result of that is that land prices are very, very low because they compare land prices with each other. They don't want to be more expensive than their neighboring municipalities. So what you get is a very low price per square meter of land for industrial estates. Well, and the result of that is clearly visible. What you get is an oversupply of new land for industrial estates, and at the same time you see that existing industrial estates are being sucked out, are becoming obsolete, are being abandoned, and that's what you see here, and they deteriorate. So there's an oversupply of land, and that has an effect on the existing city. And I think you can see something similar here in the city of Lugo. There are actually we noticed that, very few shops in the historic town where you would expect to have a lot of shops where people could buy stuff and so. But because of the provision of new shopping malls, you've got, what did you say, 10 shopping malls probably?
In Colombia. Here we have one big.
Yeah. Well, the result of that is clearly visible, I think, in the historic town of Lugo, where you have very few shops, and therefore, it could have been probably slightly more lively in the historic town. Do people know any other examples, probably, of how institutions affect urban development? Probably we can take a couple of minutes that you discuss with your neighbors, how you can explain certain phenomena, maybe in Lugo or other places where you come from, that we actually can explain through institutions. So things you can see around you that have an institutional explanation. Shall we take a couple of minutes for that? Rob? continue? Who can I give the floor? Maybe this group. Can I ask the lady here? What did you guys come up with?
I'm not sure of current. Corel is a smaller place in south of Lugo, and a link can have a difference in the depth of the European.
Speaking properly, speaking
People who live there want more industry, but they can't for European norms.
Because of European norms, they can't get more industry.
Yes.
Right, so that's something you can clearly see when you get there,
Yes.
and there is an institutional explanation for that.
Yes.
I think that's a very good example.
Other example is Coruña, if tourist city, there are a lot of big shops because people who live there
Wanted that, these big shops. Yeah. And how did they get there? Because of flexible land use regulation.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
It's more regulation is more agrees what people want.
Okay. Well, I think both are very good examples. Maybe the group at the back. Who of you four can I give? Oh, you have some examples.
I think that
First,
the university has a lot of influence because due to the university
here.
Yeah, this university, because of this university, this area grown up with a lot of buildings and neighborhoods and parks.
Right.
The city grown up to this area.
So what's the institutional reason then?
The university.
The existence of the university.
Yeah, the
Okay.
education of the university.
Right. Okay.
Also,
That's the example. Yeah. Can I then go to the group really at the back? Yeah, of course you can.
We are thinking.
I know it's a time-consuming process thinking. Any of you, don't be shy. I'm not only, well, maybe you, can you say something? One of you must be able to say something. We're all looking away now. Not going to force it. Anyone else who would like to voluntarily say, okay, I've got another example that might really illustrate the point we're making here?
Talking about the historic wall of Lugo.
The historic wall of Lugo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because probably if somebody wants to construct in the green, which is close to the wall,
Yeah, I've seen that.
it's normally it's probably prohibited, but also I think that the human perception or perception of people of Lugo could be another institution to
That is not being built
to
on.
stop this.
Yeah. I think that's a good. Yeah, that's a pretty good example. I've seen a couple. You've shown me a couple of examples of green spaces that were not being built on. Primarily, had to do. I had the feeling with archaeological remainings, and it's very expensive for developers to build on these lands. That's right, isn't it? So that's an institutional barrier for them to build on it. And that's something you can clearly see. Right. Okay. Let's continue to the last part of these two lectures, and that's actually institutional continuity and change. Like I said before, institutions are fairly stable. They are not fluid, and that's probably different from discourses that we also discussed yesterday. Discourses, storylines, ways of thinking are probably slightly more fluid than when things have become institutions. And that's what we call path dependency. And that means, and I think the image shows it nicely, you've got a path, and it's not easy to get out of that path. You follow that path because it's not easy to to break out of it. And because of that path-dependent nature of institutions, people behave on the basis of what they've learned in the past. And we will come back to why that is. I think this example is often used to show what path dependency really means. There was a time that somebody invented or thought, well, this is the right way to make a keyboard. We start with the letter Q at the left, and then we get the W, the E, the R, the T, and then the Y. And that never changed. Why is this the most efficient way to do it? And it's probably because of path dependency that we still have this keyboard and not from A, B, C to D to E to F. You know, because if we're going to change it, well, we all have probably all have a pretty big problem. We have to learn a new keyboard, and it will take us a lot of time. I will skip this because this is very technical. Why is this path dependency? And I think that illustrates quite nicely why we still have the QWERTY keyboard. Douglas North, I referred to him yesterday. He's the Nobel Prize winner in economics of 1990. And he said there are actually two factors why there is path dependency. The first one is increasing returns. That's shown in the graph in the right-hand side. If you have an institution that has been there for a while and you're still using that institution, the benefit that you gain from that investment that you made long ago will increase the more you will use it. So the more we use the QWERTY keyboard, the quicker we become, the better we get at using that keyboard. You know, so the returns of using an institution that we've learned in the past is actually increasing the more we use it. And the other factor is the existence of transaction costs, because making a new institution, learning a new institution, getting information about how to do it, takes a lot of costs, and that is what we call transaction costs. Liebekamp actually gives another reason. He says, okay, it's not so much the increasing returns, it's not so much the transaction costs. Some institutions just stay with us. They are inefficient, but they might benefit certain actors that have a lot of power. So hegemonic actors that have a lot of power, don't want these institutions to change because they benefit from these institutions. Well, that's something we could see in the clip that we saw of David Harvey, that there are banks really benefiting from all these very complicated financial products. And it's not easy to get rid of these financial products because they benefited from that a lot. Well, these are all economic reasonings, and that's what in the institutional literature is called the logic of instrumentality. And that means institutions stay because they are serving certain purposes. But sociologists also say some institutions are just there and stay with us because we just like them, or because they have become embedded, because they have been socially reproduced. And they don't necessarily serve a purpose, not always, but are still persistent because we like the way we do things. So that's what's called the logic of appropriateness. However, institutions sometimes change, and there are a couple of conditions for change to occur. And that is because there are external developments and internal institutional reflection sometimes takes place. You know, there is a crisis, there is a hazard. I think we talked about this yesterday. And then people start to reflect on institutions. Are we still having the right institutions? And there is often institutional conflict. That's one of the conditions that lies at the basis of why we change institutions. And that can be conflict between institutions, like we showed before, between formal institutions and informal institutions, for instance. And there can be conflict between institutions and social developments. In the Netherlands, for instance, the way we used to do land and property development didn't fit with the economic developments that we are now facing. So we have to go to a different model of developing land and property. So there is an institutional conflict there. And you need momentum. Certain conditions need to coincide to be able to change institutions. And I'd like to illustrate that through this diagram that I use in one of my articles. Like I said, there can be external social developments, that's at the right-hand side. There's no...
Yeah, in the middle.
Is it? Oh, yeah. Over there. And institutional reflection that takes place at the same time. And if there is enough pressure from both these angles, you get a momentum for change, or at least a momentum where people think, okay, perhaps we should change the institutional arrangement that we have. This institutional arrangement is in conflict with other institutional arrangements or with social developments, and it's not working, so we probably need to do something. And that's what we call, or what we call in this article, there is a critical moment. And that's the moment when people start contemplating, okay, how can we come up with new institutions? And if at the same time people have clear ideas of new institutions and agree on the problem perception, have the same problem perception, if these three come together and have enough power, there will probably a critical junction for change. And in that article we try to illustrate how that could work in practice. So this is sort of frame of reference to understand how change occurs. But like I said, institutions are generally quite path dependent, quite persistent, and do not change easily. But there can be circumstances, like for instance a financial crisis, like an environmental crisis, all sorts of social developments that can occur that may lead to changes in institutions. Is this a clear diagram for you, or do you need extra explanation for that? Is it clear?
Yeah, this means that path dependency is a barrier for innovation, right?
Can be, yeah.
Then how innovation takes place without being in crisis, without taking place during crisis?
I don't think you only need a crisis. For instance, in the Netherlands we see now some institutions change because of demographic developments. We are getting an aging population. I think the same is happening in Spain. And because of that, institutions are changing, and that is a very gradual process. It's not necessarily through a crisis that people start contemplating, well, do we have the right institutional arrangement? It can also occur through very gradual developments that exert enough power to change existing institutions. So obviously, and I discussed this yesterday, a crisis is a really good momentum for change, but there are also more gradual changes taking place and leading to new institutions. Are you convinced by that?
Oh yeah.
Well, this is obviously only an analytical model. We used to try to understand some changes we saw in Dutch land policy, in Dutch government structures, and you shouldn't take it too literal. It's just a device to understand things a little better. Well, I think I've come at the end of what I wanted to say to you. Like I said, we've discussed institutions, institutionalization, what are the effects of institutions on planning processes, on the planning object, and to understand why do institutions change, why do institutions stay the same sometimes. And really what I wanted to say is that institutions matter a lot for planning, so I hope it has given you some sort of framework to understand urban development a little better, to understand changes in urban development a little better. And I hope, I think you have to write a thesis at the end of this course, don't you, that it might help you answering some of the questions that you might have in that thesis. I am still benefiting a lot from this whole institutional thinking. It's something I've developed during my PhD research, and I'm now working for government. And still I find, although I'm much more practical nowadays in what I do, because the research that we do has to be policy relevant, so we can't start talking too much about Giddens and Harvey, we have to be more hands-on. But still, thinking in terms of institutions And understanding things as being institutional really helps doing my work even in as a slightly more as a practitioner. So, well, just to show you the scheme again, that might give a frame of reference for you to understand things a little better. I want to thank you for your attention and wish you a pleasant evening, rest of the weekend, live. Thank you very much.
I don't know if there is time for questions or...
Always.
Who are the drivers of change? I mean, whose actors may be drivers of change? Because here, now we are seeing that in this financial crisis, the formal institutions are the ones who are driving these changes.
Mm-hmm.
We are having changes in labor relationship. We are having changes with the health system, the education system, and everything. And the drivers or the leaders of this change are formal institutions. However, also there is an opportunity for other changes that are not taking place despite other social actors or social society are demanding them.
Yeah. Well, to answer your first question, I think it's very often just individuals like we all are who trigger change. There is an individual who has a good idea and is able to get support for that idea. And so he gets a bigger group who thinks, okay, yeah, this is indeed a very good idea. And so you more or less spread the word. Let's do it this way. If you look at Italy, for instance, at the moment, I think Monti, the president of Italy at this moment, this very individual is actually making a lot of changes, and he gets a lot of support for that. So it's often very, well, normal human beings like you and I, and like we all are, who really trigger these changes. And to answer your second question, I think a lot of these factors, I'm not sure if I can put it on again. This one. Sometimes institutions just stay because they favor existing power structures. For instance, in the Netherlands, it's very difficult to reform the labor market, and I think that is the case in many European countries, because the labor associations consist of the older labor force, and they don't want to reform labor institutions because these institutions favor them. And because these labor organizations consist primarily of these older labor forces, these institutions don't change easily. So that's probably the third bullet that you see there. Institutions might favor hegemonic actors. And that is often a very powerful explanation why institutions persist, even though they are not efficient to run an economy or a society. Is that a...
Yeah, so that means that civil society should be organized in more formal institutions in order to gain this capability to influence change?
Well, sometimes, yeah. I think in the case of labor associations, it would be good if more young people joined the labor associations and help change to occur from inside. You know?
Because we have seen the example of these huge demonstrations we have had in the last 2-3 years, and with hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating and asking for change, but these change or their demands are not being accommodated in the by the formal institutions.
Yeah.
And one of the arguments against these claims are that they have not been formalized in a political party or in a different kind of formal institution.
Yeah, that's obviously always difficult in a democracy. If you don't have legitimacy, it's always difficult to have a vote. in the political process. If you're not organized, I think you see that a lot. Politicians generally like to talk to people who have a clear representation, who have a clear organization and a group behind that organization that they know, okay, this organization is trustworthy, is legitimate, and we can have a chat with them. Otherwise, you don't know if they're not organized and not formalized. You don't know, well, who are we talking to? You know. So yeah, I think that is a major factor behind that. Yeah.
More questions?
Any other questions? No. Was that good?
I will ask you, do you believe in this thing called free markets?
No, of course not.
Of course.
That's rubbish.
That's right.
Markets are never free. You know, there's always, well, for instance, this, what do you call that? This marker is owned by the university. If there would be nothing like property rights, for instance, so ownership has to do with property rights, and property rights are created by the government. If there would be nothing like property rights, this would not have a value, because it would be owned by everybody. You know what I mean? So you need a government who creates property rights, and a government who enforces these property rights when somebody takes away this marker from me, because it's mine. And if there would be no punishment for taking away my marker, it would have no value. Do you see what I mean?
That's the tragedy of commons.
Well, to some extent it's a tragedy of commons, yeah. Yeah. So if it's owned by no one, it will be misused, overused, overconsumed. So you need property rights to organize society in a way, and there's only one actor who can organize that in such a way, and that's government. They can create these property rights and enforce property rights when they are breached.
So do you think that in the case of Houston, if there were no such regulations there that you mentioned, the shape of the city would be completely different?
If there would be no regulations?
Yeah, the regulations.
Well, maybe not. Often regulations are in line with what people want. You know what I mean? So yeah, it could be different, but then there would be informal institutions, like they have a lot in Houston. So there, for instance, Houston, Texas has the biggest, what they call master planned community. There is a neighborhood in Houston of 90,000 people, which is regulated privately. So there is no public regulation in that area. The people regulate the whole area by themselves. So there is a restrictive covenant which regulates what can be done in that whole neighborhood. So people come up with their own regulations. And actually that's of course how government has emerged. Government is a way of society to organize society. So we have all invented government ourselves. It's not something that's just outside us. We are the government, and the government is our own invention. But maybe I'm now getting a bit philosophical.
Yeah, if you are getting philosophical, I have a question for you. Samuel, do you think we can consider economic efficiency as an institution of capitalism economy?
If efficiency is an institution, yeah, maybe it is. Yeah, it is. Obviously, efficiency is something we invented. It's not something that is just out there. No, it is probably an institution of the capitalist system.
And in terms of planning, some paradigms.
Sorry?
In terms of planning, could you do you think it's also possible that looking for economic efficiency when organizing our uses is not looking, let's say, sometimes economic efficiency is understood as a characteristic of market-oriented things,
yeah.
but in a way it's an institution because it's something created, as you said.
Yeah, but I see the market as an institution. The market is something we created, you know, and therefore its efficiency is also an institution. I don't see this as very absolute words, you know, the market, as if that is some entity on its own somewhere. You know, I wrote an article called Neither Government Nor Market, and I'm saying in that article, they are so intertwined, these two. The market cannot exist without the government. If there is no government, then the market doesn't work. So, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah, I see efficiency as an institution created by, probably by the capitalist system. So created by ourselves, basically. Oh, we're getting philosophical.
Now I have another question, just small, I don't know.
Yeah. More down to earth, or?
Yeah, it's like, if you think that, okay, government and markets are together, when there is no, why do you think that in some places of the world the government is so small? Why? Because you think people like to control things in formal, they have like their structures to control, to manage things, and they want government taking the responsibility? Or why? Do you think that in some places the government is small and cannot act in such a degree, like for instance in the Netherlands? So it's, you know, it doesn't have this power to manage or to run an economy.
Well, what are you trying to say with
I'm
that?
trying to say that in some places of the world, the government are powerless, are
Yeah.
weak, and also I think they, in those places, the markets don't work very well. So
Yeah, I agree with you. I think in some places government intervention has been more institutionalized than in other places. And yeah, that's the consequence of institutions. That's something we create and also change and reproduce. And in some places people are not able to organize themselves, or they don't like the government very much. For instance, in Houston, Texas, people really hate the government. They want the government to do as little as possible, unless it favors them, obviously. And you know, that's probably part of the political economic culture that they have there. They, you know, Texas has always been, or for a long time, been the frontier of American territorialization. So people owned their own land, they had a gun to protect their land, and they didn't need a government to interfere with them. And that's what you see in more places. They just don't like the government.
But nevertheless, they created an alternative government there in Houston.
They
in Houston, even with more restrictive laws than a normal municipality will implement.
How do you? Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure. I think there are in other places there's even more restrictions than in Houston, Texas, because these restrictions that I was showing were very.
I mean, this neighborhood you talked about.
Yeah.
They created their own planning regulations.
Oh yeah. That's what you mean. Yeah, these regulations go much further, are much more detailed than what a government would do. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. But that's actually a mini government that they created there. And actually, that's how it has worked in the past. We have created government to protect ourselves against ourselves and against our neighbors. And that's what you see at the micro scale in these master plan communities that they have over there. That's how government works. Yeah, I agree with you. Any other questions? If you prefer asking something in Spanish, there is translation. There is translation available at the back.
yeah, the translators online.
Yeah. Okay. Well then, once again, thank you very much for your attention, and hope to see you some other time.